Hi, it's Mo. It is May 17th and I have not even started my monthly reading wrap-up yet, so it's time to do another vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. These are videos that I do every month where I talk about the books that I've read throughout the month as close to when I've read them as I can. Obviously, that did not happen this month, but there was a lot going on. I went away at the beginning of this month and, you know, there's a lot happening, so I have to give myself a little grace for that. But I also try to talk for only about 5 minutes for each book. I try to tell you something about the book, whether I liked it, maybe you would like it too. The first book that I finished in May, a reread for me, and it is The Devil in the Dark Water by Stuart Turton. So my boss really likes fantasy and he likes to read, which is super fun for me. He's kind of like a rejuvenated reader, so we get to talk about books, which is very fun. And he said that I should read The Tainted Cup because he had just finished that duology, or the duology part of that series that's out, which we'll get back to later. But I read the sample of that on Libby and it reminded me a lot of like the tone and the environment and like the vibes of The Devil in the Dark Water, which I read a few years ago on audio. So I decided to pick this one back up. I really liked this one. It took me a long time to get into and I thought it was too long the first time I read it, but reading it again on audio through Libby, I loved it. Libby or Hoopla, I can't remember. So I'm super glad that I reread it. The Devil in the Dark Water is a historical fiction mystery with speculative elements, perhaps. It's about our main character, Errant Hayes, who is like the bodyguard and protector of Samuel Pepys. And they are leaving an island in the West Indies and going back to Amsterdam on a merchant ship with like the colonizing leader of that island. We quickly learn that Samuel Pepys is like an amazing, great detective, very much a Sherlock Holmes style character, and Errant is his Watson, his sidekick. Errant is a person who seems to be all brute force. He seems to be the body to Samuel Pepys' mind. But as this book goes on, we learn that because Samuel Pepys has been imprisoned by the colonizer of this place, there's a character map in the beginning of this which is super helpful. Governor General. So the Governor General who asked Samuel Pepys to come out in the first place has now imprisoned Samuel Pepys and is taking him back to Amsterdam for trial to kind of pay for his crimes. So Errant Hayes is his protector and Samuel Pepys is going to be locked up. But right before they get on the ship, a mysterious event occurs. There is a warning on the ship that the ship is going to be in peril in its journey, and Errant tries to get the Commissioner General to let Pepys free, but he won't. So Errant Hayes has to go and kind of discover what that warning was all about and figure out what's going on this ship. Bad things start happening and people start dying and different things are going on that Errant doesn't know how to tackle because, like I said, he also thinks of himself as being like the body, the muscle, and not the brains of the operation. Luckily, Errant Hayes does have the Commissioner General's wife, Sarah, helping him. She is really not supposed to be doing that, but she also wants to get to the heart of this potential threat to the ship. This story takes place all on the ship, which is super cool. It's almost like an armchair detective with Samuel being locked away and Errant having to kind of bring clues back to him. We are trying to find out, along with Sarah and Errant, what is happening. I just think there's such a great atmospheric vibe to this book that just really captures you and you are immersed in when you're reading the story. And to me, that makes me just want to continue to read the story. Like, I just want to be in that world with them, and I love it so much. I don't want there like to be a sequel to this book or anything, but like I would love to be more in this world and I would kind of like to see the characters again. This reminded me of a much drier, less obvious humor Amina Al-Sarafi. So if you like pirate stories, if you like stories of indomitable odds against good-hearted but potentially ambiguously moral people, this is definitely a good one. Like I said, it's not overtly funny, but there are definitely some funny elements to this. There's some heartwarming moments to this. There's a little bit of a blossoming romance to this. There's friendship and found family. There is at its heart like a pretty good, enticing mystery. So you definitely want to know like what is happening on the ship, and you definitely want to figure out this mystery. So I really loved it. I'm so happy to have reread it. I loved it way more this time than the first time that I read it. I read it on audio again. Because I had read it previously, I was able to up the speed a little. So even though this is a super long audiobook, you can up the speed a little because it is very slowly pronounced. But I was even able to do it even more, and that gave the story a little bit more like urgency in my idea of it, which I even also enjoyed more, I think, than the first time I read it. So would definitely highly recommend. The next book that I finished in May is Everyone on This Train is a Suspect by Benjamin Stevenson. This is the sequel to Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone, which I read last year. I just found this at a book sale in April, I think, and I was so excited to read it because I think these books are better read physically, and I had been really in the mood for it, and I know I can get it on audio, but I really wanted to read it physically because there's kind of just some elements of structure and type that, I don't know, I think work better physically. So like there's some lists in here. I'm trying to find that list. These mysteries are very direct to reader. So the main character, Ernest Cunningham, is talking directly to you, and he is a writer, but not an author necessarily. He wrote like books on how to write books for the internet and like made money that way. And in the first book, we learn about his past, and we see him traveling to a remote mountain ski lodge with his family to reunite with some of the family members that he hasn't seen in a long time. And through that book and through finding out that everyone in his family has killed someone, we learn about his family dynamic, and the different relationships there. In this book, he has written about his experience, a nonfiction book about his time on the mountain and what happened there, which is called Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone. So it's very meta, it's very direct to reader, it's very much his like diary journal of what happened. He's telling us that the first book is as well. Even the prologue of this book is him writing to his editor and being like, I don't think a prologue really works here. They're just super fun books to read. They're super fun to physically read, to like look at and read, and they're super quick because there's a ton of dialogue, and even when it's not dialogue, he's talking to us, so it is kind of dialogue. This book, he has written his memoir, his experience, his nonfiction of Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone, and he's going on a writer's retreat where you can go with the writers that you love, and they're all mystery and crime writers, so he's the only nonfiction writer there, and it's on this train that goes from the bottom of Australia to the top of Australia. All these books are Australian, and Benjamin Stevenson is an Australian writer. He is on this train, and then there is a murder on this train, and he wants it to be murder because he needs to write another book. So he starts investigating this murder, similar to how he investigated the events in Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone. I think these books are best gone into knowing very little of the plot. They're just fun, they're fast, they're super silly and tongue-in-cheek, they're very meta, they're very direct to reader, and you're just along for the ride. So I won't tell you much more about that, but I think this was a fun sequel. I think it was interesting to see how the events in the first book were kind of played with in this book, and how the direct-to-reader element was like amped up in this book. I don't think that the characters in either of the books are like super memorable. Like I didn't already remember a lot of what happened to his family in the previous book, but you don't necessarily need to. I think you do need to read these in order. I think you need to read Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone and then read this one to really grasp what's going on. But like I said, they're super fast, so you might as well. Benjamin Stevenson has one more book in this series. It's like a Christmas novel or novella, so I definitely want to get my hands on that one. I know that one features features an advent calendar kind of style. So again, I would definitely prefer to read it physically than to read it on audio, and that's how I suggest reading all of these books. The next book that I finished in May is When We Were Birds by Ayanna Lloyd Bonwo. This is a story set in Trinidad, and it is about a young man who leaves his mother and goes to another part of the island or another island in Trinidad, I'm not entirely sure, to find work. He has struggled to find work, and his dad left them when they were young. He doesn't really know anything about his father. His mother won't really tell him anything. She does not want him to go to this other part of Trinidad to work, and she definitely doesn't want him to work where he finds work, which is in a cemetery. So our main character starts to figure out why his mother doesn't want him to do that and figure out the pitfalls of working in this cemetery. Then we have another perspective, which is a young woman, Yejide, and she's going through the process of losing her mother. So her mother and her have always had a very strained relationship, and she's not entirely sure why, and she's always felt really bad, guilty, and angry about this. So she's dealing with her mother dying, and eventually that leads her to the cemetery where our other main character, Darwin, works. And then we see kind of how those two people are connected. This is a very slow burn book with some slight speculative elements. I really, really enjoyed this one. I read this book on audio, which I definitely highly recommend because the narration is great, the accents are great. If I'm remembering correctly, there is a man and woman narrator for the two different parts, which I don't usually like, and I don't usually like dual perspectives like that, but they're not one and one chapter wise. So we get quite a few of Yejide's story, quite a few chapters, and then quite a few chapters of Darwin's story without just bouncing back and forth really quickly. I don't like that in books, and I don't like that in audiobooks. I really, really enjoyed this one. I think this is the first book that I've read that was set in Trinidad, and I can't wait to read more. If you like slow burn stories of people's connections and the kind of stories that take you a while to figure out what those connections are, I would definitely like this. But there was also like some action in this. There was some suspense. There was some dread and some worry in this that, you know, highlight the story and heighten the story. There was also tender moments and familial connections. So I really, really enjoyed this one, and I would highly recommend. The next book that I finished in May was The Blanks by Grady Hendrix. This is the first Grady Hendrix that I've read, and this is a short story that I get free with one of my subscriptions. I am trying to get rid of that subscription, so I'm trying to read as many of these stories as I can. This is a very new horror collection that they've recently put out. This is the third book that I've read in this collection. I like all of them so far, so I'm definitely going to try and finish this collection. The Blanks is about a young woman who, she and her family, her husband, her older son, and her younger daughter go to Long Island. They're from New York. This is kind of set in like a untethered future time, not too far distant future from our own. They live and work in New York, and then they go to Long Island, New York for their vacation. And it's very much a Long Island vacation town that they go to. You know, there's like kind of older houses, but they cost millions of dollars. Tons of tourists come in and buy these houses and live there, and then tons of other tourists that don't have houses come in every summer. And the majority of this book is kind of this woman telling the story of how they got this house and how they ended up being there, and the feelings that being on the beach and on Long Island give them, and the closeness to their family. But as she's telling this story, you're seeing little glimpses of maybe dangerous or spooky elements that are happening. And the more we learn about this kind of near future time, the more we see some scary ideas that are happening, and the more we find out that maybe this isn't the best place for this family. So this one was really good. It was pretty shocking. It was a little bit on the longer side, being a little bit over an hour. And I read this one while I was driving like an hour on a dark highway in Arizona, so it was like kind of a strange landscape, but also kind of a summer vibe, which I think fit pretty well. And I was really captivated by the way this story was told. So I would definitely highly recommend this. And I plan on reading more Grady Hendrix. I have one Grady Hendrix book that I own physically, which is My Best Friend's Exorcism. I have tried reading that one on audio, or at least I've listened to a sample, and I didn't really like it. But I really want to read the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, which I don't own physically, but was on a book list that I made way back at the beginning of BookTube. So I think I'm going to try that one, at least try the sample of that one and get that one on audio and read that one before I read My Best Friend's Exorcism. The next book that I finished in May was Spy Family Volume 1. This is by Tetsuyo Endo, and it was translated from the Japanese by Casey Lowe. This is a manga graphic novel, and I don't know if I've ever actually read a manga. It does go the correct way for a manga, which is opposite of the way that we normally read. So it was an interesting learning experience to try and read that way. This one took me a little bit to get into, but once I did, I read it all in one day and I really, really enjoyed it. It's about Twilight, who is a spy for a nation that is at war with another nation. It's obviously set in Japan, but it kind of has like a German feel to it as well. And it's definitely out of time and place and in like kind of a made up time and place. Twilight is a spy, and he's kind of given his whole life over to being a spy, and through this first book, and I'm sure through subsequent books, we'll find out more about why he did that. Twilight uses disguises, and he kills people, and he steals things, and he returns things, and his next big assignment that he gets is that he needs to infiltrate a kind of highbrow academy for young students, so he needs to find himself a family. He goes to the orphanage and he finds a young girl, and then he stumbles upon another woman to be his wife, but these people have more to them than meets the eye. The young girl is a psychic and the wife is an assassin, so they're all on their own paths. They all have their own reasons for being there. They all are on their own missions, but they come together and they work together in this first volume and kind of form this tentative family. So I really like this one. I will definitely keep my eye out for more. If you like kind of silly spy novels and that found family and that like rock'em sock'em fast-paced manga anime style, I would definitely check this one out. There were a couple of things in here that seemed a little like outdated or strange, but overall I really enjoyed it, and I think it was just timing of writing and cultural that didn't quite align with my own sensibilities. The next book that I finished in May is Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver. Eldridge Cleaver was a young man. He's from California, and he was imprisoned in the 1950s and 60s when he was very young. He got out of prison and then broke parole and ended up going back into prison, and eventually he did get out and become one of the founding members of the Black Panthers. This book is written mostly in 1965, and it's part epistolary novel with letters that he sent while he was in prison, kind of dissecting his life in prison, talking about what led him there, the very, very bad things that he did, and his idea of America during the time of civil rights. So he talks a lot about civil rights. He talks a lot about prisons and how prisons works. He talks a lot about women and men interaction, and obviously black and white people interaction. So a lot of it has to do with white oppression of blacks in America at this time, and his hope for the future, and hope that during this time, during the civil rights, things will get better and the oppression of black people will lessen. Little did he know. So this one was really interesting. It was a really fascinating read, and because it was broken up into almost different essays, sometimes letters, sometimes actual essays, sometimes letters back and forth between him and other people, it was pretty quick to get through. The subject matter made it tougher and made it harder to get through, but I thought it was a really fascinating inside look at someone who was going to go on and be more prevalent and prominent in the movement, But that being said, his life story takes like a weird turn after this and after being part of the Black Panthers. So I did look that up on Wikipedia. There's definitely horrible things in here. He was a criminal. He did rape women. He did rob and do terrible things. This book is not an excuse for that or even an explanation of that. So you just have to know that that is a part of his character as well. And if that's something that you can't get over reading from him, you might not want to read this book. But I thought it was interesting to hear his thoughts on his own life and his own issues and his own wrongdoings, and then how that interacted with civil rights and with the state of America at this time. So I thought it was really fascinating. Like I said, later in life, he goes on to maybe not continue to not be a good person. So, it's just something that you have to note. But I do think that this was a really interesting look at someone processing the civil rights movement during the civil rights movement and who had a unique perspective on it. I didn't enjoy it. It wasn't an enjoyable read, but it was an informative and interesting read. The next book that I finished in May was The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is the first in the Shadow of the Leviathan series, and like I said, my boss wanted me to read this, so I decided to pick it up on audio. I got it from Libby. This is a pretty long, like 14-hour audio book, and it is a mystical, magical, other world, fantasy world place. Right away, we meet a young man who is an apprentice to an investigator, and he's going to investigate a death that has happened in like a very rich person's house. So we meet him and we kind of learn how he became this apprentice or low-level investigator, and we start to learn why his boss isn't there with him, and we start to learn their relationship, and we start to learn more about our main character Din and why he does what he does and what he's like and what this world is like. And our main character Din looks into this potential outbreak, this potential sickness, this death, and when he brings the information back to his investigator, to his boss, it turns out it's probably a murder. So we go on an adventure with Din and with his boss to some extent to figure out what this murder is. I don't know if you need to know very much about the plot of this book. It is a fantasy mystery. The main investigator, Anna, being an armchair investigator for the majority of the book, and with Din being her proxy and the person that we identify with. Because this is a completely new, to me at least, fantasy world, like there's nothing I can really tell you about it. You just have to read it, If you like fantasy, I would say this is like middle fantasy. I don't think it's super, super high, but there is a lot of words that you don't know and aspects of the world that you don't know and things that you kind of have to figure out over time. I feel like it was a little too fantasy for me. I did enjoy it, and I will read the second. I've already put it on hold on Libby, but I think after that second one, I don't know if I would read any more. It took me a long time to get into this fantasy world. It took me a long time to figure out what was going on. I don't love things where I have to learn about new words and concepts and magic systems. This one was pretty easy to get into. I would say very easy if you're very familiar with fantasy, but for me, obviously, it took longer. I did like the world. I did like the character development of Anna and Din. I liked their relationship, and I liked just the atmosphere that was provided in this book and how this book wove kind of a new fantasy world. Like, I enjoyed the world. It was interesting. I would like to learn more, which is why I'm going to read the second in the series. So if you like fantasy, I would definitely give it a shot, especially if you like fantasy mystery, because I did like the mystery and I thought the mystery was interesting. I didn't think it was as compelling as the mystery in The Devil in the Dark Water. I didn't think the conclusion was as exciting, but I liked it. And because you like the characters, you do want to see how they discover the mystery and what they do with the information. So if you like fantasy and if you like fantasy mystery, I would definitely check this one out. The next book that I read in May was Every Heart a Doorway by Sean Towne McGuire. This is another reread for me, and I read this one because when I was on my trip to Arizona, I downloaded it off of Hoopla so that I could read it on the plane if I needed to read something on the plane. It's like a 4-hour plane ride, and I did manage to sleep most of the way both times, so I didn't actually read it, but I had it downloaded from Hoopla, so I decided to give it a reread. Every Heart a Doorway is the first in the Wayward Children series, and this series is about children who have gone through their magical door into their magical world and then been forced out for one reason or another. So think Narnia, think Alice in Wonderland, people who have gone through doors and experienced life, and that life beyond that door was where they were really supposed to be, but they find themselves back in the real world and they don't know what to do with themselves. So some of them end up at Eleanor West's Home for Wayward Children, which is a boarding school where children with that experience can communicate with other children, with other people who have had that, people who can sympathize with them, and they can not hide who they are, because the majority of the people who end up at Eleanor West are people that have been labeled crazy, who their parents or their friends or their guardians want them to get back to normal. But because they've lived in their real worlds, because they've lived in the worlds they want to, they find it very difficult to reacclimate. There are other schools, which we learn about later in the series. Every Heart a Doorway follows a new person, Nancy, who is just coming into the school. So Nancy acts as a proxy for us at Eleanor West, and she learns about Eleanor West as we are, and we find out what the school is all about and why Eleanor has a sign over the door that says no quests. So we learn a lot of different characters, a lot of different things, and we see Nancy's story in this book. And then in subsequent books, they're either at school books or off-world books, kind of. So they're all adventures, and the ones at the school hop around, but the ones that are off-world, like the next in the series, are kind of the past. We see each character not always a different character, but often a different character in their world, and what happened and how they got there and what they did there and how they got kicked out or how they got ejected through the door back into the real world. So I really like this series. I think I like this one better on reread too. I know that when I first read Every Heart a Doorway last year, I liked it okay, but I didn't love it. I think this is a series that you need to read as a whole series. The more you read it as a whole series and not as individual books, the more you will fall in love with this series, and that's definitely what happened to me. I don't think I'm going to continue on with this series right away. I do have books 2, 3, and 4 on my shelves. They're right over here. I'm up to date in this series, and I read them all in audio last year, except the new one that came out in the beginning of this year, which I read in the beginning of this year, and I would kind of like to read them physically. So I think when I want to continue on with The Wayward Children #2, I will read it physically. But these are really great on audio too, so I highly recommend them on audio if you have the chance. Those were the 8 books that I've read so far in May, and when I read some more, I will let you know. Hi. It is June 2nd, and I have finished my May reading. I think I only did one check-in so far in May, and I think I might have been sitting in the same spot and possibly wearing this same shirt. So if I did, it really is another day. But I'm here to finish talking to you about the books that I read in May, and the next book that I finished in May was When the Reckoning Comes by LaTanya McQueen. So this was one of my most anticipated reads for like a very, very long time, and I found it this year at a library book sale. I did end up reading this one on audio, and I really enjoyed the audio. This is about a young woman, Myra, I think her name is Myra, and she is returning to her small town in the South for a wedding of one of her best friends when she was little. So she and this best friend have been out of touch for a really long time, but this white girl who was like a poor white girl who kind of hung out with a lot of the people of color when they were in high school and around that age, begs Myra, our main character, to come back for her wedding. But when Myra gets there, she realizes that this wedding is going to take place at a former plantation that has now been converted into like a slavery theme park park / banquet hall. Not only does Mira think it's totally weird that anyone would want to have a wedding on a plantation just as a event venue, but also there's like demonstrations of like slavery, like, oh, you can go watch people picking cotton in the field, and like you can go watch someone cooking in the kitchen, and you can go to the slave quarters and like see the houses. And Mira's totally freaked out by this, but she does decide to go to this wedding, and she decides to stay at the wedding despite being on this plantation because the possibility of seeing her other long lost best friend comes up. So Mira's at this wedding trying to reconnect to these people that she knew when she was younger, and through this story we learn about why they lost touch and about the strange events that happened on this land when Mira was a little girl, and her connection to the land, her connection to slavery, echoes of slavery, and the ripples in the pond of the world of slavery that still are affecting people today. So this one was really interesting. I did really like it. It's definitely a social horror, and there are parts that are like more description of what has happened in the past, either Mira's past or more likely further in the past on this plantation during slavery. And then there's this story of Mira and her two long lost best friends going on as well. And then there are some horrific elements, but like I said, even those horrific elements are more a social horror and more the horrors of slavery. I did enjoy it. I think that if this had been the first book like that I had read, I would have enjoyed it more. I think that The Deep by River Solomon touches on this. I think Sorrowland by River Solomon touches on this. I've read a couple of other books. I'm trying to think what they were. I'll have to go back and look at my list to really let you know what some of the other books that touch on this subject, and kind of do it in a similar way where we see things from the past and how they affect things in the current day, and that the past is never really laid to rest, is never really done with, which is true about slavery in America. Like, once you've learned, which of course we weren't taught in schools here, that slavery is the basis for so many of our social constructs today, housing constructs, redlining, Jim Crow, prison, and all those different things. Like, once you know that, it's impossible not to see those echoes in everyday life, in real life, and realize that so many of our social norms are built on the enslavement of Black and brown people and people from different ethnic groups and from different locations on Earth for our own gain. So I think that, like, if this is the first one you're reading, it's a good one. If this isn't the first one you're reading, it might seem like it's been done before, because it has been done before, because it's actually been done before in real life. I did enjoy this one, and I would definitely read some more LaTanya McQueen. I liked the narration on the audiobook, so I think that's a good way to go. I don't know if maybe it would have been a little bit more impactful or more suspenseful if I read it physically. I find that reading on an audio, because when I read audio I'm doing other things, sometimes the impact of horror is lessened. Sometimes that's to my benefit because then it's not as scary, but sometimes it's to the detriment of the story. So however you like to read horror and however you want to be impacted by horror, maybe you would go one way or the other. The next book that I finished in May was Born by Jeff Vandermeer. So my friend, who I know still through Instagram, but I knew in Brooklyn, has been telling me to read this for a really long time, and I did read this for like a themed video that isn't finished yet, but I'm very glad that I did read it. It's very interesting. I was worried about reading more Jeff Vandermeer because I love the Southern Reach trilogy so much, specifically the first 3 books. The 4th book is kind of like, the first 3 books I have now read twice, and I really, really love them, and I was worried that Born would be too close to those books, and so I wouldn't like it, but I didn't really need to worry about that. It's a very different story. The writing is still similar in that Jeff Vandermeer really writes like nature writing, but like alien landscape nature writing, like nature writing of things that don't actually exist, of nature that isn't actually in nature, but all kind of wrapped up in actual nature center of the world. So Born is about a young woman, Rachel, who is kind of living in this post-apocalyptic desert wasteland. She is a scavenger and she is making her way. She has found a partner and a lover and a friend, but mostly they kind of use each other for their skills, like a connection with someone in this wasteland. She's younger, he's older. She goes out and scavenges things for him, and he creates things out of the biomaterial that she scavenges to help them live in this horrible wasteland. It did remind me a little bit of Fallout New Vegas, which I really love. Anything that reminds me of Fallout is a vibe, you know? I really enjoy it. One day, Rachel is scavenging and she finds a piece of biochemical technology in this world where this biotechnology breeds and lives and comes from one specific place or creates itself, and she names that biotechnology Born. Born is like kind of a little squid vase type creature when Rachel finds him, and then they grow up together. So Rachel and Born form a connection, and the man that she has a connection with previously is like really dubious about Born, and he wants to take Born apart and use the biotechnology, but Rachel won't let him. And then this is the story of those three entities' relationship and how they survive in this like horrible, destroyed environment, and how people's connections are still so important even when everything else in the world is turned upside down. So I really did like this. It's told it almost like as instructive text, so it'll say like what I did to others and what others did to me, and then it'll have like these kind of short vignette pieces, where I came from and who I was. So it's broken up into different sections. It's broken up in almost an instructive or instructive diary sort of format, which I thought was interesting. It did take me a while to get through because it is pretty bleak, and there's definitely hope in this story and love in this story, and certainly like survival, but it is like pretty bleak and some horrible things happen. There's a lot of violence, there's a lot of grotesque things that go on, and horror elements, just like in the Southern Reach trilogy. So that seems to be a signature of Jeff Vandermeer. I've now read 5 novels, including this one, and I think 2 short stories, and I do love Jeff Vandermeer's writing, so I definitely plan on continuing. This is a series. There's a 1.5 and a 2 in this series, and I would love to get my hands on both of those. And then he has another series that's very long, like the first book is like 800 pages or something, and that has to do with like mushroom people, so I would definitely like to get my hands on that. I have quite a bit more Jeff Vandermeer to read, which I'm very excited about. The next book that I finished in May was The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. I've had this one on my shelves, I think, since 2023. It came out in 2020, and it is about Tuki, who is a Native American woman who was sent to prison, and right in the beginning you find out why she was sent to prison and how long her sentence was, but luckily it was commuted. What is that word when your sentence gets shortened? Commuted. Once she gets out, she starts working at a bookstore, which is an actual bookstore in Minneapolis that is actually owned by Louise Erdrich. So it's a little bit meta. Louise is a character in this book a tiny bit, but we mostly follow Tuki, and we follow her once she's gotten out of prison and how she reforms her life. I don't want to say reform, like she's not reformed because she didn't do anything that she thought was wrong, but she did have drug addiction problems, so we see her struggle with that. She did have problems making connections to people, so we see her struggle with that. We see her love in this book, we see her ties to family, and we see her struggle with her acceptance and understanding of her connection to her Native American heritage and how that kind of comes and goes. And the whole backdrop of this book is the pandemic and is the murder of George Floyd. So that is all touched upon, and what that makes Tuki think of and how that affects her life and the lives of the people in Tuki's life. And then throughout this book, Tookie is also being haunted by the bookstore's most annoying customer. So we find out why this spirit, this person, has not left the mortal plane and is still there, reaching out in some ways to Tookie, and what Tookie thinks of that, the lengths she goes to, what she does to try and exorcise this spirit or put this spirit to rest. So I really, really like this one. This one sounds like a wild premise. There's so much going on. There's jail, there's, auto fiction, there's real people in fictional situations, there's real places in fictional situations, there's the pandemic, there's the murder of George Floyd, there's a ghost, there's other customers. But it's really a story about Tookie, and it's really a story about her and her acceptance of what's happened to her in her life and her processing of that, and then what she chooses to do with the information that she processes and how she chooses to live her life after the hardships that she's gone through. This book is divided into different sections, and then the sections are also divided into small areas, and sometimes those continue the longer story. Well, they all continue the longer story, but sometimes they're more focused on one or two people in Tookie's life or one or two stories of Tookie's history. So we get to see different people, meet different people. This would be an interesting one. I know Louise Erdrich has a lot of series, so this would be an interesting one to continue on with the series and maybe follow some of the other people in this story. I really like this one. It's a much quieter, simpler story and a much quieter and simpler book than I was expecting, but I really loved it. I have also read Future Home of the Living God by Louise Erdrich, which is also a pandemic plague novel, which was not intentional that these are the only two books that I've read. I have a ton of her books, so I will definitely be reading more of her work. I really love her writing. And I think what was interesting about that one is that it's set in a future time where a pandemic has changed the world. But it is also kind of quiet. Even the scary things that happen in that book, even the excitement, even the thrilling moments, feel genuine, feel very real. They don't feel like heart-racing, heart-pounding, jump scare type things, and the same thing happens in this book. The feeling that this brought up of the pandemic, the realness of the grief and the anger at the murder of George Floyd is so genuine and so relatable, and that was something that I did go through. So it's interesting that in this book and in a book of something that I didn't go through, it feels very real and it feels very visceral to my person, but also in the story. I did read this for the TBR Spin, so you can see more of my thoughts in that blog when it comes out. The last book that I read in May, I only read 12 books in May, which is half of what I read the previous month, but that's okay, was A Drop of Corruption by Robert Jackson Bennett. So this is number 2 in the Shadow of the Leviathan series. I read number 1, The Tainted Cup, earlier this month, and I wanted to jump right into this story again because it is a fantasy world. I'm not a big fantasy reader because there is a lot to learn about the world, because there is a lot going on. I didn't want to read this one too long after, or I would forget a lot of what was going on. I really enjoyed The Tainted Cup. The Tainted Cup follows Din and Anna, investigators in this fantasy water world where leviathans are these great giant creatures that come up on shore and destroy towns and cities and cause death and destruction. And this is kind of a medieval, kind of a monarchy sort of place where the different islands, the different factions, the different lands have different kings, and those kings control different places, but then there's also an overarching empire, and Din and Anna work for the empire. And in the first book, The Tainted Cup, which I've already talked about, we see Din and Anna coming together, getting to know each other. Anna is a investigator, but she is a very strange investigator, so Din, who is hand-chosen by Anna, has to get used to her quirkiness and has to get used to how she works, which is different than other investigators. In A Drop of Corruption, a few months or a few years have passed since the first book, and we see Din and Anna and their relationship being much more on solid ground. Din really understands Anna in a lot more ways in this book, and he understands what they do a lot more, and he's better at his job job. He's solved quite a few cases, and these two investigators are specifically sent out when there's death or murder that is like really, really bizarre. So in the first book, Din kind of gets his first taste of this, and in the second book, he's already kind of dealt with it. But Din is feeling like all he does is solve murders that have already happened, and he doesn't help the world at large. There's so many people doing things on the wall to fight the Leviathans, to protect the population, and Din doesn't really feel like he's doing that. And Anna, throughout this book, kind of tries to show him that he is doing it. And you can kind of guess what happens because there is a third book in this series coming out. So I really enjoyed this series. I really enjoyed the characters. I like that there's a little bit of like modern speech thrown in. Like Anna curses a lot, and you know, she is very like brash and forward, whereas Din is very proper. You know, he loves to like make a cup of tea, he loves his routines, and then Anna is like all over the place. And throughout these two books, we learn why those people are like they are and what might be behind their natures to make them who they are. I struggle with fantasy. I struggle with like having to learn magic systems and new words and new phrases and new ideas. Not that I don't like new ideas. I love to learn new ideas from real life. But in a fantasy world, sometimes to me it seems like, why am I learning this information when it is not going to be relevant in real life? That is not teaching me anything about real life and real cultures and real words and real language. Sometimes that really bogs me down and I struggle with it, but it was really nice to read A Drop of Corruption right after The Tainted Cup because I knew the world. I didn't have to learn a bunch of new stuff. I was able to use the knowledge that I gained from the first book to extrapolate some of the things that they were talking about. So it didn't feel like I was wasting my time learning all this new stuff of a fake place. It felt more like a comfortable place to come back to. I really enjoyed that aspect of reading this sequel. So I might continue on with the series. I love that they are mysteries at their heart, and the mysteries are interesting and you do want to know what's going on, and then the mysteries do have larger implications for a grander story of this world. I like books like that, so I might continue on with it. I don't know, I didn't look up when the next book comes out, so I don't know if it'll be a long wait. I don't know if I'll have forgotten a lot by then, so I think it'll be like a last minute decision. The second one just came out in 2025, so it's definitely not going to be this year. So those were the 12 books that I read in May. I did read my TBR Spin book. I had a reread that I really liked that was inspired by two other books that I read, and then I read that series. I binged a series, which I never do. I continued on with a series, which I rarely do, but that was exciting. I started a bunch new series. I read a highly anticipated read. I only read one book for the Asian Pacific Island Hawaiian Heritage Month, which I am disappointed about. I usually do like to read Asian American or Asian books during that time, and I do like to take the opportunity to read like Hawaiian books during that time. But there was a lot going on in May and I didn't really focus on doing reading challenges, so that's fine. My reading was still great. I read a nonfiction. I read a book set in Trinidad and Tobago, which I really enjoyed. This seems like forever ago, by the way, but it was a great book. I had another reread with Every Heart a Doorway. I had a great reading month. It was super fun. It's so interesting to me that like I can have a great reading month whether I read 28 books, whether I read 12 books, whether I read 2 books. You know, I really think that that tells you a lot about how all reading counts and that you don't need to read a lot of books. Like, it's better to read at the pace that you're comfortable with, whether that's fast or whether that's slow, and enjoy the books that you're reading as opposed to just reading to read or reading for the numbers. I mean, I'm reading to read, but reading for the numbers. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!